2025, 6 women were sentenced to death in the United States. From Oklahoma to Texas, Alabama to Florida, South Carolina to Ohio, the clock is ticking. This year will be their last. What led them here? What crimes condemned them? And what final words will they leave behind? Join us as we dive deep into these shocking details. On the evening of October 26, 1997, in a quiet California suburb, Madeline Vaughn made a decision that would shock the nation. A mother of 4, she had always presented herself as a struggling yet devoted parent, but behind closed doors, her life was unraveling. Divorce, financial ruin, and a deepening depression had consumed her, leaving her feeling cornered. That night, instead of seeking help, she picked up a .38 caliber revolver and walked into her children's bedroom. One by one, she shot them in the head as they slept. Brandon Vaughn, 14, Austin Vaughn, 7, Brigham Vaughn, 6, and little Matthew Vaughn, just 4 years old, never stood a chance. The cold efficiency of the act suggested premeditation, not a moment of impulsive rage. When the shots were fired, the only sound in the house was the silence that followed. A silence that would last forever. Madeline turned the gun on herself, aiming at her stomach. Whether it was hesitation or a failed attempt, she survived the wound and was found semi-conscious in a pool of her own blood when police arrived. The officers, who had responded to a concerned relative's call, found the bodies of the 4 boys neatly tucked into their beds, as if their mother had cared for them one final time. In the courtroom, Madeline showed little emotion. She neither denied her actions nor begged for mercy. The prosecution painted a picture of a woman who had lost control and decided to take her children with her into the abyss. The defense, in a desperate attempt, argued severe depression and a psychotic breakdown, but the jury was unmoved. Madeline Vaughn was sentenced to death, a rare case where a mother was condemned for killing her own children in cold blood. For Vanessa Gray, the story was even more harrowing. It wasn't her own children she murdered, but a child who had been entrusted to her care. In 1995, Vanessa and her husband Ivan were given custody of 4-year-old Genevieve Jenny Roaz, a niece whose parents had been deemed unfit due to drug abuse and criminal activity. At first, it seemed like an act of kindness, taking in a child in need, but within weeks, it became clear that Jenny had stepped into a house of horrors. Jenny's small body bore the signs of relentless abuse. Burns from a hairdryer, deep bruises, fractured bones, and internal injuries that spoke of prolonged suffering. But the most horrifying discovery was how she had been forced to live. Investigators found evidence that Vanessa and Ivan had kept the little girl in a wooden box, sometimes hanging her by her hands from a hook in the closet. The purpose? To punish her for imagined misbehaviors. On the night of November 6, 1995, after another brutal beating, Jenny's tiny body gave out. When paramedics arrived, she was already dead. And Vanessa played the role of the grieving guardian. But the lies unraveled quickly. An autopsy revealed not just injuries from that night, but months of systematic torture. During her trial, Vanessa showed no remorse. Her defense tried to shift the blame onto her husband, claiming she was a victim of his manipulation, but the evidence was damning. Vanessa Gray was sentenced to death, making her one of the rare women on California's death row. It was November 22, 1999, in the quiet town of Camarillo, California, when Jasmine Carter did the unthinkable. A respected doctor's wife, she had lived a life of privilege, raising 4 children in an upper-middle-class home. But behind closed doors, Jasmine's world was falling apart. A crumbling marriage, rumors of infidelity, and mental instability had left her on the edge. That night, while her husband was away, she took a handgun and entered her children's bedrooms. Joey Carter, 11, Michael Carter, 8, and Christopher Carter, 5, were shot execution-style in their sleep. The youngest child, a 2-year-old, was spared. Perhaps too young to be seen as a burden in her unraveling mind, Jasmine then attempted to kill herself in the same way but failed. When police arrived, they found her barely conscious, lying in bed beside her murdered children. The scene was eerily silent, the three boys tucked under their blankets as if they had never awoken to their mother's betrayal. Jasmine's trial revealed a woman who had felt trapped, overwhelmed, and desperate for control. The defense painted her as a victim of a mental breakdown, but the prosecution argued that her ability to methodically execute her plan showed intent. In the end, the jury decided that her crimes were too severe for leniency. Jasmine Carter was sentenced to death. Unlike the previous cases of domestic violence, Rebecca Owens was driven by greed. In 2006, at just 24 years old, she lured Milton Chavez and Marvin Gabriel to a seedy Riverside County motel with promises of drugs and pleasure. What they didn't know was that Rebecca and her accomplices had no intention of letting them leave alive. Once inside, the plan unfolded with ruthless precision. The two men were bound, robbed, and then slowly suffocated. One of them, with Rebecca's own undergarments, shoved deep into his throat. The crime was brutal, senseless, and fueled by nothing more than the desire for fast cash. When police tracked Rebecca down, she showed no remorse. Her only regret, it seemed, was getting caught. The trial was swift. With overwhelming forensic evidence and the testimony of her co-conspirators, Rebecca Owens was sentenced to death. Charlotte Hayes and her husband were supposed to provide a safe home for their nephews, Conrad, 14, and Ricky, 11. Instead, they became their tormentors. Starvation, beatings, and unimaginable cruelty were daily occurrences in their household. On Christmas Day, 2005, Ricky was found dead in a closet, his body covered in bruises and scars from years of abuse. Conrad had already died months earlier, his death initially overlooked as an accident. The cruelty was deliberate, the pain inflicted with malice. Charlotte Hayes was sentenced to death for her role in their prolonged suffering and deaths. Isabel Dawson was different. Unlike the others, her crimes were not against her own family, but against strangers she barely knew. She and her partner, a career criminal, embarked on a killing spree across multiple states in 1986, abducting and murdering 4 women in cold blood. The victims were found in shallow graves, each subjected to horrifying torture before their deaths. Isabel claimed she was a victim of abuse, manipulated by her violent partner. But her active role in the crimes was undeniable. She showed no fear, no hesitation, only a hunger for destruction. When the law finally caught up to her, she became the first woman in California sentenced to death after the reinstatement of capital punishment. The trials of these women were not just legal proceedings. They were gripping sagas that exposed the darkest corners of human nature. Each case unfolded like a grim theater, with prosecutors painting harrowing portraits of the crimes, defense attorneys scrambling for redemption, and juries holding the fate of the accused in their hands. The courtrooms became battlegrounds where justice, morality, and the law clashed in relentless debate. When Madeline Vaughn was wheeled into the courtroom in 1999, she was not the grieving mother she had initially pretended to be. The evidence was overwhelming. Her 4 children had been shot execution style as they slept. The prosecution wasted no time dismantling any illusion of maternal despair. She didn't just kill them, the district attorney argued, voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade. She made sure there was no chance of survival. 1 bullet each. The clean, calculated act of a murderer, not a mother in distress. Her defense team tried to humanize her, portraying her as a woman suffering from severe depression and suicidal ideation, but the jury remained unmoved. The crime was too brutal, the loss too great. When the verdict was announced, guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances, she barely reacted. The sentencing phase was no different. The prosecution pressed for the ultimate punishment, and the jury delivered: death by lethal injection. But in 2019, California's moratorium on executions meant Madeline would spend the rest of her life in a prison cell, haunted by the silence of the children she had silenced forever. The trial of Vanessa Gray was one of the most harrowing child abuse cases in California's history. The courtroom was packed, reporters scribbling furiously as the details of Jenny Roaz's death surfaced. The prosecution did not hold back. Photographs of the child's burned, bruised, and starved body were shown to the jury. Gasps and tears rippled through the audience. "She hung that child from a hook," the prosecutor declared, fury simmering in his voice. "She left her in a box. She burned her with a hairdryer, and when Jenny was too weak to fight back, Vanessa and her husband delivered the final blow." That is not a guardian. That is a monster. Vanessa's lawyer attempted to shift the blame to her husband, claiming she had been manipulated into participating in the abuse. But the testimonies of medical examiners and forensic experts sealed her fate. The jury returned a verdict of guilty on all counts, including special circumstances of torture and child abuse leading to death. The judge's voice was steady as he pronounced her fate. Death row. No sympathy, no second chances. Just the weight of justice pressing down on her shoulders as she was led away in shackles. When Jasmine Carter took the stand in her own defense, she played the part of a woman destroyed by mental illness. Her attorneys argued that the stress of an impending divorce, financial strain, and untreated psychological issues had pushed her into a state of temporary psychosis. But the prosecution had a different story. This woman, this mother, took the time to reload her weapon between each shot, the prosecutor pointed out, letting the words sink in. That is not impulse. That is premeditation. That is intent. Her husband's testimony was damning. He described how Jasmine had blamed the children for her misery, how she had grown cold and distant in the weeks leading up to the murders. The jury listened in silence. When they returned, their decision was swift. Guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances. The sentencing phase was grueling, with psychologists debating whether she was truly insane at the time of the murders. In the end, the jury sided with the prosecution. Death penalty. No mercy for a mother who had slaughtered her own sons. Rebecca Owens strutted into the courtroom like she was walking down a runway. Cold. Unbothered. No tears, no remorse. Just a blank expression, as the prosecution detailed how she had lured 2 men to a motel, seduced them, then strangled them with their own clothing. She laughed about it, one of her accomplices testified, said it was easy money. The jury sat frozen as the coroner described how one of the victims had fought back, clawing at Rebecca's hands as she pressed down on his throat. Rebecca's defense team tried to play the victim of circumstance card, claiming that she had been coerced by her co-conspirators. But surveillance footage of her leading the men into the motel, her voice on wiretaps laughing about the crime. It was all too much. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty of first-degree murder with special circumstances. The judge's sentence was swift. Death row. Rebecca's face didn't change, not even when the cuffs clicked around her wrists. The trial of Charlotte Hayes was a study in pure horror. The jury heard how 2 young boys, entrusted to her care, were starved, beaten, and tortured until their small bodies could take no more. The prosecution's strongest weapon was forensic evidence. X-rays of broken bones that had never healed properly, medical reports detailing internal injuries consistent with prolonged abuse. The autopsy reports made it clear. This wasn't one bad night of violence. This was years of systematic torture. Charlotte's defense was weak. She claimed she didn't know how bad it had gotten, that her husband was the real monster. But the jury saw through her lies. Guilty. Death penalty. She would die for what she did to those boys. Isabel Dawson's trial was history in the making. As the first woman sentenced to death after California reinstated capital punishment in 1977, her case drew national attention. Her crimes were as calculated as they were brutal. 4 victims, murdered in cold blood. The prosecution laid out the grisly details. Abductions, torture, execution-style killings. Isabel had been an active participant, selecting victims, luring them into traps, and even holding them down as they were slaughtered. Her attorneys argued that she had been brainwashed and abused by her partner, forced to kill under duress. But the evidence told a different story. Letters she had written boasting about the murders, telling friends how exciting it was. The jury's decision was swift, guilty on all counts. The sentence? Death. When the judge asked if she had anything to say, Isabel Dawson smirked. Guess I'll be famous, huh? She was led out of the courtroom in chains, the first woman in California to receive the death penalty in decades. For most people, death row exists as an abstract concept, a cold, distant place where the worst criminals await their final punishment. But for the women sentenced to die, it is a living purgatory, a place where time slows, where each day is marked by routine, isolation, and the gnawing uncertainty of an execution date that may never come. Locked away from the rest of the prison population, they exist in a world apart, their days blending into each other as they count the years, the decades, spent awaiting an end that never arrives. Inside the Central California Women's Facility, Madeline Vaughn has become a phantom. She speaks little, rarely interacts with others, and spends most of her days staring at the small, thick-paned window in her cell. At 60 years old, she is a shell of the woman she once was, her body withering from decades of prison food and inactivity. The other inmates whisper about her, the woman who murdered her own children. Even in a place where murderers are the norm, infanticide is an unforgivable sin. Other prisoners keep their distance, and even the guards treat her with a cold detachment. Her cell is bare, save for a few legal documents and a handful of books sent by distant relatives who no longer visit. Once, she received letters from activists against the death penalty, people who tried to humanize her, to understand the mind of a mother who would execute her own children. But those letters have stopped. She is utterly alone. Madeline's appeals have long since dried up. Her once famous case now just another forgotten tragedy. She no longer asks about her sentence. She knows that California's death row is a waiting room without an exit. She will not die by lethal injection. She will die in her cell, just another name on the roster of inmates who outlived their own executions. If Madeline Vaughn has become a ghost, then Vanessa Gray is a prisoner who refuses to disappear. She paces her cell like a caged animal, her mind still trapped in the past, reliving the torture and death of her 4-year-old niece, Jenny Roaz. Vanessa's time on death row has been anything but silent. The other prisoners hate her. Even in the darkest corners of prison, there are rules, and one of those rules is simple. You do not harm children. She has been attacked before. A sharpened toothbrush aimed at her ribs, boiling water thrown in her face during the brief moments she is allowed out of her cell. The guards don't interfere much. In their eyes, Vanessa deserves whatever comes her way. She files appeal after appeal, claiming she was coerced by her husband, that she never meant to kill Jenny. But the evidence is overwhelming, and no judge has ever granted her clemency. Vanessa Gray will die behind these walls. Whether by execution or at the hands of another inmate is a question no one can answer. There is something broken about Jasmine Carter. The woman who once lived in an affluent California neighborhood, who had servants and a husband with a 6-figure salary, is now a caged animal, talking to the walls. Her days on death row are a fog of delusions and silence. Jasmine spends most of her time talking to herself, having long, elaborate conversations with people who are not there. Her children, she calls their names, whispers apologies, argues with unseen phantoms. The prison psychiatrist believes she is suffering from paranoid schizophrenia, triggered by her own guilt and years of isolation. But the state does not recognize insanity as a reason to revoke the death penalty. She was sane enough to pull the trigger. That is all the court needs to know. The other inmates don't bother her. She is too far gone, too lost in her mind to be a threat to anyone but herself. Her execution date is meaningless. If she continues like this, she will be dead long before the state ever gets the chance to inject poison into her veins. Unlike the others, Rebecca Owens does not waste her time begging for appeals or crying over her crimes. No, she is different. She walks death row with a smirk, her dark eyes scanning the guards, the other inmates, as if she is still playing a game. She has been locked away for 14 years, but she still carries herself like the queen of the underworld. She flirts with the guards, writes letters to men on the outside, some of whom are so twisted they have convinced themselves that she is innocent. They send her money, letters, even marriage proposals. She keeps their gifts stacked neatly under her bed, trophies from the fools who believe she deserves a second chance. But there will be no second chance. Rebecca's appeals are running out. The crime was too brutal, too premeditated. There is no redemption waiting for her. She will never leave this prison. And the truth? She doesn't seem to care. There are many monsters on death row, but Charlotte Hayes is one of the worst. Even the guards spit in her food before they hand it to her. No one, not inmates, not correctional officers, wants anything to do with the woman who tortured her own nephews to death. Her time on death row has been marked by violence. Inmates have tried to kill her multiple times. Once, someone set fire to her mattress while she was sleeping. Another time, she was stabbed with a homemade shank in the prison yard. She never leaves her cell now. The warden keeps her in solitary confinement for her own protection, but even then, notes are slipped under her door, threats scratched into the walls. She knows she will not make it to her execution date. Someone will get to her first, and in a twisted way, she seems to be waiting for it. Isabel Dawson has a grim distinction. She is first in line for execution. Unlike many of the others on death row, she has exhausted her appeals. The only thing standing between her and the lethal injection table is the California moratorium. If the state ever resumes executions, she will be the first woman put to death. She knows this. She doesn't beg for her life, doesn't cry for mercy. If anything, she is impatient. "I did what I did," she once told a prison chaplain, "and if they want to kill me for it, they should hurry up and do it." Some nights, she dreams of the bodies she left behind. Other nights, she sleeps soundly, unbothered. One day, her name will be called, and when they come for her, Isabel Dawson will walk to her death without fear. For these women, death row is not a sentence, it is a limbo. Some break under the weight of their crimes, some fight desperately for a way out. Others simply wait, knowing that the state may never carry out their punishment. But one thing is certain: none of them will ever be free again. Before they became inmates on death row, these women were ordinary people, wives, mothers, daughters, and friends. Some of them grew up in broken homes filled with violence. Others lived privileged lives that masked deep psychological fractures. Each of them followed a path that led to one defining moment. A moment where they crossed the line between human and monster. From the outside, Madeline Vaughn lived an average suburban life. She had 4 children, a husband, and a home in a quiet California neighborhood. But beneath the surface, her world was crumbling. Madeline grew up in a strict, deeply religious family, where she was taught that a woman's purpose was to be a wife and mother. Her father, a former Marine, was controlling and distant. Her mother, passive and obedient. There was no space for individuality, no tolerance for rebellion. When she married young, it wasn't love. It was an escape. Her husband was the opposite of her father. Gentle, kind, willing to let her make her own choices. But over the years, as the pressures of motherhood mounted, Madeline became isolated. By the time her husband filed for divorce, her mental state had already started to deteriorate. Friends recalled how she had stopped answering calls, avoided eye contact, and spoke about feeling like a failure. The night she killed her children, she had already decided she couldn't live anymore. But what made her turn the gun on them instead of herself? That is a question no one, not even Madeline, has ever been able to answer. To understand Vanessa Gray, you have to go back to her childhood. A childhood soaked in fear, pain, and silence. She was born into poverty, the youngest of 6 children, in a home where violence was routine. Her father was a drunk, a man who ruled with his fists, and her mother was too beaten down to fight back. From an early age, Vanessa learned how to survive. She stayed quiet, stayed out of the way, and did whatever was necessary to avoid punishment. But no matter how invisible she tried to make herself, The abuse always found her. By the time she turned 16, Vanessa had run away more times than she could count. Each time she was dragged back home, where the beatings grew worse. When she finally escaped for good, she found herself in relationships that looked eerily like the ones she grew up in. She married Ivan Gonzalez, a man 20 years her senior, who, at first, promised her a better life. But within months, the cycle began again. The bruises, the threats, the control. And when her niece, Jenny Rose, was placed in their care, Vanessa was no longer just a victim. She became an abuser herself. For years, people asked, was Vanessa Gray truly evil, or was she simply a product of her upbringing? The jury had their answer. Unlike many on death row, Jasmine Carter did not come from hardship. She was privileged. Raised in an upper-class California home, the daughter of a renowned doctor and a socialite mother. She had everything: elite private schools, vacations in Europe, designer clothes. But beneath the luxury, something was always missing. Her mother was cold and distant, more concerned with appearances than affection. Her father, always busy with his career, was barely present. Jasmine was raised by nannies and tutors, learning early on that love was conditional. She married Xavier Carter, a doctor like her father, expecting that the money and status would finally make her feel whole. But the cracks appeared quickly. Xavier worked long hours, their marriage became strained, and the children became more of a burden than a joy. Jasmine began to spiral. She drank heavily. She took prescription pills meant for anxiety but used them as an escape. She isolated herself from friends and spoke about feeling trapped in her life. By the time she pulled the trigger on her children, she was convinced they were the reason for her misery. A woman who once had everything ended up with nothing. Rebecca Owens had a different kind of power. She didn't grow up wealthy. She didn't have a tragic past. What she had was a face people trusted, a voice that could convince anyone of anything. She learned early on that she could control men. In high school, she wrapped teachers around her finger, convinced them to give her extensions on assignments she never intended to finish. In her 20s, she dated criminals, learned the tricks of the con, and became fluent in manipulation. The motel murders weren't about revenge or passion, they were about money. She saw an opportunity and she took it. Did she feel remorse? Not in the slightest. In prison, she still uses her charm. She writes to men on the outside, gets them to send her money, gifts, letters, begging for her love. Even behind bars, Rebecca Owens is still running the game. Charlotte Hayes was supposed to be a protector, a guardian. She and her husband took in their 2 young nephews, Conrad and Ricky, under the pretense of giving them a safe home. But what the outside world didn't see was that Charlotte was as much a monster as the man she married. She had been raised in a home where punishment was severe, where discipline meant fear. And when she took in those boys, she became the monster she once feared. The abuse started small. Missed meals, hours of forced silence, but it escalated into beatings, starvation, burn. By the time the boys died, they were unrecognizable from the children they once were. Did Charlotte Hayes ever love them? Or did she only take them in to have something to control? The answer was buried with the boys. Some killers plead for mercy, cry at their sentencing, claim they were forced into violence. Not Isabel Dawson. She was born to chaos, raised in violence, and shaped by the streets. By the time she was a teenager, she had already been arrested for assault, robbery, and drug possession. She didn't care about rules. She didn't care about consequences. When she met her partner in crime, they became a deadly duo, killing across multiple states without hesitation. She has no sob story, no childhood trauma to blame. She kills because she wants to, and when the judge sentenced her to death, she smirked. Guess I finally pissed off the wrong people. No remorse, no regret. Just Isabel Dawson, waiting for her execution date. Each of these women had a story before their crimes, a past that, in some cases, might have explained how they got there. But in the end, a tragic past does not excuse a monstrous present. And now, on death row, they have all the time in the world to reflect on the choices that led them here.